this video is in association with Gaia.com. For the full interview, go to Gaia.com/Paul Wallis for access to thousands of thought-provoking documentaries and original programs. Follow the links in the description below. Have you ever seen something that's not yet happened? Or maybe you've future viewed a person that you've not yet met. In my book Echoes of Eden, I explain why I'm so fascinated in this whole topic of remote viewing. I've experienced it myself, I've sat at the feet of shamanic healers who can do it, and I've seen young children who are able to do it too. G'day and welcome to the Paul Wallis channel. My work is in the field of paleocontact. That's the theory that in the deep past our ancestors had contact with visitors from other civilizations. And my route into that topic has been through the study of ancient texts and the world's ancestral narratives, and in particular by going to the root meanings of the key words in those ancient texts and indigenous narratives. And I find that's a wonderful way of peeling back centuries of doctrines and assumptions regarding what our ancestors had to say to us. Now, from time to time, I'm asked, does that approach have any bearing on Jesus and what he was on about? And the answer is absolutely, yes it does. There's an amazing saying that comes right at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and it's a summary of the message that Jesus stood with for the first year of his ministry. You go to the root meanings, and the message sounds like this: go beyond the mind, because the whole cosmic realm is available to you. I can't imagine a bolder invitation to explore what's possible than that. But what do those words trigger in your mind? What does that exploration sound like? Is that spirituality? Or is it astrophysics? And if we are to learn to manipulate and play with the principles and properties of the cosmic realm, does that mean science? Or does that sound like magic? Today we're going to look at a person whose work straddles all of those boundaries, a fascinating Welshman by the name of John Dee, who served in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. And we're going to sit at the feet of researcher and author Jason Louv in conversation with my friend Regina Meredith on Gaia's Open Minds. And then at the end, you and I can sit down together and compare notes.
Wow, what a beautiful work you have done with your book. It's absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
John Dee and the Empire of Angels. And you really put a lot of really rigorous research around it, where other people have looked at it more esoterically, and there's a lot of conjecture in some of the books. You really have, I think you've really nailed it. So this man is still, his work, his influence is still reaching into our times now, both in terms of religion and politics, and I think it's really valuable for people to understand the genesis of some of this thought, some of these philosophies. So, without further ado, let's go into the life and times of John Dee. Give us a context for his life, okay?
Sure. So the reason this person is so important is because in our culture, at a certain point in our history, science and magic diverged. They used to be the same thing. People who were interested in science were also interested in the esoteric side of things. And then they split and they went their own ways, and science became modern science, and magic kind of went off into its own, world. So, but John Dee, who was the scientific advisor to Queen Elizabeth I and one of the most brilliant people of the 16th century, the person who was responsible for bringing mathematics to the public, for coming up with the phrase the British Empire and laying down the plans for there to be a British Empire, who really laid the groundwork for modern science to happen, was also completely fascinated with magic and the esoteric world, and is maybe one of the most brilliant thinkers that spirituality has produced, and is one of the rare people who synthesized the two. And I say synthesized, but really they just hadn't separated yet. They were the same thing. So in our modern world, we're coming to a point now as a culture where these things are starting to come back together, and people are interested in both. They're interested in science, wonderfully so, and also interested in spirituality and magic and the esoteric side of things because they want something deeper. They want a deeper experience of life and understanding what being alive means instead of, but they want to figure that out on their own terms without it being imposed by, like a top-down church or something like that usually. So for that reason, I think he's a fascinating person for us to learn from and just to understand ourselves and where we've been and where we're going.
I agree with that. And to the point, Dean Radin, a scientist and paranormal researcher both, especially in the world of quantum entanglement, just came out with a new book called Real Magic, right?
Yes.
And now starting to boldly even embrace the title to bring the two together in this world. So you're right on target on that. I think one of the problems is that people have learned to be very polarized in their thinking and do not understand that these characters throughout history, most of them were very colorful people. And we say, how can someone who would do such a thing also come up with such a thing? And so we're going to get into some of that, some of the contrasts within John Dee, his personal character, also Edward Kelly, who he associated with, who brought through channeled information, and help people understand and get comfortable with the notion you don't have to be a saint to be brilliant and make a contribution to society, and that's true today as well. So Francis Bacon, wasn't Francis Bacon more or less a contemporary in the day?
He was very inspired by Dee. Bacon came after Dee, and Francis Bacon, of course, created the Baconian method, which became empirical science. But he was very influenced by Dee's thinking. In fact, all of these guys were. Francis Bacon, René Descartes, the early scientists who became the Royal Society in England. All of the early scientists were totally fascinated by Dee's work because Dee was the person who had laid the groundwork for science to happen. But they were also interested in magic and the esoteric. They were fascinated with the idea of Rosicrucianism and the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, which was this kind of story that was being told around Europe that there was this secret group of people working to enlighten Europe, to bring science to Europe, to get Europe away from the domination of the church. This all comes from Dee. Previously, you mentioned that people are very polarized in their thinking now. It's either magic or science, and neither of these camps talk to each other. And I've come across this myself a lot. My way of seeing it is the same that they did, which is there's really only one thing going on, which is humanity's quest for knowledge and humanity's quest to make life better and learn more about the universe. And the spiritual side of things is a tool for that. The scientific, purely materialistic science side is a tool to do that. But these guys were thinking they were big picture thinkers. And that's the type of thinking that I really want to encourage. We should be thinking, how can we make the best possible scientific advances with science on its own plane? How can we also bring people the best spiritual technologies, if you will, to make them happy, and foster a sense of connection and well-being and happiness in life. So, and understanding life and putting it in context and what it really is. So I'm very inspired by those guys, and they were.
Well, you're a classic new representation of a Renaissance man.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
You are. You truly are. And so at the same time, when you look at Bacon, for example, what an incredible mind. But many think to be the actual, at least part of, or if not the better part of a body of Shakespeare's work, authorship of that. I think that's in the intelligentsia circles is kind of accepted, but then also doing it under contract to rewrite the King James version of the Bible. And I mean, again, how did you perceive that part of his role in the world to rewrite the Bible into this everlasting, at least the last few hundred years, King James version of the Bible?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and there was so much going on at this time. Those guys, both Bacon, Shakespeare, John Dee, yeah, of course they were all working together. There was a lot going on behind the scenes, some of which is historically accepted and some of which is conjecture. But it's just very clear to me, observing that period in history, that there was a group of very, very intelligent people, a real intelligentsia, who were working with everything they had to modernize Europe and bring new ideas of spirituality and scientific advance and world exploration and art and drama in the case of Shakespeare, and then yes, the modernization of the Bible. And the fascinating thing about all these is the real common thread with all of them is the faith in the liberation of human beings from superstition and control, the idea that human beings should be free to pursue happiness, to pursue scientific truth, to pursue religious truth on their own terms. Those are the ideas that became America. All of these things were manifested finally as the United States, which was a project of these guys, including Francis Bacon.
The new Atlantis.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting because, again, when we go into these layers, and we'll wrap it up on Bacon in a second, in the King James Version, here you have this, again, this has withstood some test of time, last I read that there were 26,000 versions of the New Testament alone that exist. But in this particular one, the dominant one, it's used almost in a fundamentalist way because of our lack of nuance in thinking. But if you look at it from an intelligence point of view, it's said to be written in layers of understanding for those with eyes to see, that it actually had quite a lot of these Renaissance understandings of magic, science, and life embedded in the actual text of the King James Version of the Bible, if you can see it and see the patterns.
Absolutely. And if you look at there's so many different versions of the Bible.
Yes.
But if you look at the King James, and the King James is not even necessarily the most academically accurate one because things have moved on so much, but the language is so beautiful. The language is incredible, and absolutely there's layered meaning in there. You have to remember that at this time period, they didn't have TV, they didn't have the internet, so they loved to play intellectual games. I mean, people knew Greek, they knew Latin, they knew Hebrew. They loved to play word games and puzzles and translate things back and forth, and that was how intelligent people, stimulated their minds.
Right.
And it was a common language. So if you go back and look at these things, which I'd spent a lot of time doing, writing this, you see that you're dealing with a much higher caliber of thinking than is common now. And there are, in the sense is if somebody was watching our TV shows 100 years from now, they're not going to get all the little jokes. They're not going to get the little winks and the pop culture references. It's the same there, but where the winks and the pop culture references are layers of spiritual meaning and Kabbalah and Rosicrucianism and esotericism and, as you said, things that are there for people who have eyes to see. It's thrilling to go back and find it.
It is, especially when you open to the notion that these men also had an understanding of the cosmos, and even not just cosmology, but astrology, in Dee's case, an understanding of astrology. So if we understand that all of them had a relative understanding of our cosmological connection, right? Throughout that we are universal beings in a larger system, then you start reading these texts and it starts looking entirely different again. So there are these layers over layers. And so that wraps up the Bacon part. I just wanted to say that, yeah, he did that under contract. Yeah, it can be used in a fundamentalist way, just like any of the work of these guys. Or yes, it can be absolutely magical. And that's up to us to develop a nuance in our own understanding and intelligence.
It's important. I mean, just to wrap that up also, it's important to realize that for exactly the point that you mentioned, which is people go back to that text and read it totally literally, totally as a fundamental reading. What they're missing is all the layers of metaphor and simile, and then the artistic metaphors, and then underneath the artistic metaphors, the coded meanings and Kabbalah and Rosicrucianism.
Cosmic and all of it, yeah.
It's beautiful, It's like you look at Shakespeare. I mean, people can barely read Shakespeare now.
Right.
You think about how many layered meanings are in Shakespeare, and you apply that to the spiritual texts of that time period, and you can't make a fundamentalist reading of it.
No.
It's too surface.
Right. And so you're attempting to bring back the nuance to all of it. So let's go into his understanding, the Elizabethan hierarchy of the day. They did believe that there was a God, there were angels, and there were intermediaries and demons and so forth. Let's talk about how John Dee perceived that world.
Absolutely. So the Renaissance view of the world and the medieval view of the world was basically this. Everything is one thing. Everything that we see that is perceivable is God, right? And it's all one system, and it works functionally perfectly, and it's kind of like a watch where all the gears are wound up and everything is working perfectly. All the parts are working perfectly. And we've lost that. Now we see the world as chaotic and meaningless.
Everything's separate.
Everything's separate, and I think that it's a flaw in our consciousness rather than that our understanding has changed. But the way that people saw it at the time was as a hierarchy. You had God at the top, followed by the angels, followed by people, then followed by animals, plants, minerals, and then you got to the lower spirits, the infernal realms. But they saw everything as interconnected, or holographic is the best way to talk about it. If you take a classic metaphor, if you take a printed hologram, not a projected one, they used to have hologram stickers that came in trading card sets,
yes.
right? So you take one of those and you cut it up into 7 pieces. Each of the smaller pieces will contain the entire hologram.
Right.
That's how people saw reality as working. So they thought that, for instance, you could understand if man was made in God's image, then you could understand God by understanding a human and by seeing nature. And all these things were in resonance. There's the classic William Blake line, I could see eternity in a grain of sand.
Yes.
Right? That's basically what they're talking about.
Right.
And that was a very comforting worldview for people. It was a world where everything made sense and was in order.
Exactly. There was an inherent orderliness to it. And so that was also John Dee's own internal belief system, right?
It was, and it was the worldview of scientists at the time. So now we think of science. Science had a very different flavor at the time. Now we think of science as moving forward in time, as being progressive, as that we're discovering new things about the world. In the Renaissance period, the scientists of the time, the proto-scientists, believed that knowledge was degrading over time instead of getting better. They thought that essentially perfect knowledge had been given to mankind by God in the Garden of Eden, and then it was lost during the fall of the Tower of Babel, and more was lost during the fall of Rome and Greece. You remember, they were coming out of the Dark Ages. They were just recovering knowledge. They were just recovering the knowledge of the classical world.
Right.
So their view was, we have to go back and recover what we've lost. So they were looking backwards and saying, if only we can get to the original knowledge that we had, then we'll understand. And John Dee's way of thinking was even more extreme, which was, what if we can connect directly to God and ask Him? And if we can't do that, then maybe we can talk to God's angels at least, who might be a bit more ready to have a conversation with us, a bit closer to our level. That was their way of seeing things. And so John Dee pursued this quest with everything that he had because he thought that was the way to learning, to getting more light, more knowledge.
It's perfectly logical. I mean, really, if you take a babe and let them grow up, naturally this is what we would evolve to, is trying to understand the invisible principles that make something so, right? And so they were just, I think, operating on very natural principles in asking that question. And if you can bring it through the hierarchy of beings who inform, makes even more sense. And then once scientific materialism became the religion, so to speak, all of that's been blocked, and a massive amount of real understanding has been blocked at certain levels, not at the top level, but at that next tier down and the next tier down, because at the top level it seems to be there are always those who are able to use both realms of information, all realms of information, to their benefit.
Yeah, I think that people who are really intelligent and naturally curious and who have not lost their curiosity,
right,
as so many of us do because of how we're educated and how our society is, it's a natural way of thinking. I think that people who are naturally curious see things in the big picture way.
Right.
And they're just curious about, why are we alive? Why are we here?
Right.
And they're not afraid to look in lots of different areas to try and understand that question.
Right. Well, let's talk about Dee. Let's talk about the other side of his personality. He was all these brilliant things. Why was he in prison for sorcery and conjuring and all this? And and in addition, how did this affect his need to really put forth science in the world?
Right. So Dee lived at a very politically dangerous period of history. England at the time had just left the church. They'd kind of done their own Brexit. And Henry had separated the Anglican Church from the Catholic Church. And so what that meant was there was war, spiritual war between the Catholics and the Protestants. And Queen Mary, who was Henry's daughter, when Henry died, Queen Mary became queen, and she was Catholic, and so there was a kind of a Catholic reconquering of England. And a lot of people were burned as heretics or imprisoned as heretics or who were Protestants. And then when she died, then Elizabeth came in, who was Protestant. And so it was back and forth. And we've seen that fight go on even to the modern day. In Northern Ireland, for instance, this was a serious thing. So Dee was a confidant and a friend of Elizabeth, and at one point had been asked by her actually just to do astrological charts of all things. That was it. He had been asked to draw out birth charts of Elizabeth and potentially Mary.
Royalty's always been interested in astrology and the big picture.
Of course.
Yeah.
To this day.
To this day.
Yeah, it's kind of their thing.
Yeah.
It's big in England, you know.
Yeah.
But he was found out doing this, and this was a punishable offense. It was considered sorcery. They assumed that, you know, Elizabeth and Dee were conspiring to somehow use magic to unseat Queen Mary from the throne. All he'd done was draw out birth charts. But for this, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London with other Protestant heretics. He was tortured. He was forced to reconvert to Catholicism publicly. It was a mess, and he was in that situation until the regime changed and Elizabeth became queen. So it definitely changed his attitude. Before that, you have to remember, this person was a pure academic, somebody who was just seeking after knowledge. He truly believed in bringing higher knowledge to humanity. He truly believed in England and doing what was best for his country. And I think it was it definitely changed him to get that treatment. But
How did it change him?
Well, as you mentioned, he spent a lot of time trying to resuscitate his reputation.
Right.
Until the end of his life. He was trying to convince people that he was a true
Christian.
He was a true scientist. Yeah. He wasn't a black magician.
Exactly.
And they were constantly accusing him of that. The irony is that the other side, on Queen Mary's side and the Catholic side, they were using black magic to try and, you know, get their goals and attack the Queen Elizabeth and all of this. So it was a messy time.
Anyway, let's talk about math and his love of math and how this feeds into his esoteric understanding of life even.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, people hear math and they immediately, it's like an allergic reaction, you know, oh God. But when you understand it the way that Dee saw it, it becomes totally fascinating, where Dee thought that math was the language that God uses to talk. You know, it's that simple.
He's not the only one. A lot of people think this now. Yeah.
Yeah. And he basically, you know, again, with the backdrop of religious wars, you know, people fighting over who's right, Dee wanted to figure out, well, what's the truth? And the conclusion that he came to, which I think is completely accurate, is that, and I think most scientists and mathematicians would agree with it, is that if we really want to understand reality, if we want to understand what's true, you have to go to pure mathematics, because you can't fake it. The numbers don't lie. Well, statistics might, but pure mathematics don't. And so he thought that, for instance, the fact that there are mathematical constants that repeat throughout nature, like pi and phi and e and all these things, the Fibonacci sequence, the fact that there are repeating sequences shows that there's some type of inherent structure to reality. I mean, you can't deny that. And so he wrote the introduction to a book called The Elements by Euclid, which was the first big textbook on higher mathematics that was brought to the public, in which he says that mathematics is not just a way of, you know, counting dollars,
right,
or pounds at the time in England. It's a way of
quid.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way of understanding reality, and it's a way of talking to God. And he actually says in that book, it's so crazy. He says that, you know, we may have come to a time period where there's no longer any big revelations. All the big revelations came to the desert prophets long ago. But even if we can't get divine revelations, we have math, and maybe that's just as good, because it's a way of understanding what reality actually is. And again, I mean, I think it's an out there way to put it, but I don't think mathematicians or scientists would argue against that. It's just said in slightly different language.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And maybe that was also part of his love of astrology, the pure mathematical movement of the cosmos and its interface with the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Math again. Also, his work was influenced by Hermes and the Corpus Hermeticum. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the Hermetic texts are kind of an underground tradition of literature that's been around since the death of Christ. And before that even, there were Hermetic writings.
Before.
Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy field. There's Hermetic texts from Egypt, from the Coptics, from the Gnostics.
And the Egyptians said from Atlantis. Passed down from there to the Egyptians, to the Coptics, go ahead.
Right. And it's an interesting literary genre, and it's a literary genre where there are claims like that made at Atlantis, and then there are also claims where it was written by Hermes Trismegistus. This turns out to be a pen name that a lot of different people shared. There was probably never one Hermes Trismegistus. But it's a genre of literature that looks at reality in the way that I've been saying, as if it's one thing, one substance, and can be understood directly without an intermediary of a church.
Right.
And that's a dangerous idea. It was a dangerous idea then that you could understand reality through experiment and direct revelation instead of a church hierarchy telling you what to believe.
That's what I love about it.
It's dangerous now. That's
Love
still a
it.
dangerous idea.
Love
You know,
it.
That's really what the Hermetica, I mean, it's
Yes.
it's an incredibly complex literary genre, but that's
Yes,
what
it
it
is.
comes down to.
Yeah, so he was influenced by that because that was his own approach, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. It formed the intellectual underpinnings, not just of his approach, but of the people who, the Rosicrucians, the people who became the scientists. If you think of it this time, there's two big competing schools of thought, the Catholics and the Protestants, and they're at war, these giant titans fighting each other, and in between there's this little third option,
Yeah.
which is the Hermetics who are...
And the Rosicrucians.
And they're like, well, why don't we just actually do experiment and figure out what reality is instead of
Yes.
fighting over what we think it is? And it was that underground that became modern science.
And he wrote, ultimately, the Monas Hieroglyphica.
Yes.
And tell us what that is and what its influence was.
So the Monas Hieroglyphica is a short text. It's only maybe 10 pages long, 15 pages long. And it's a book that synthesized everything that he knew about the Hermetics, alchemy, astrology, science, mathematics into one text that he said has the key to the mysteries and explains all of reality, and also explains the key to alchemy, which is what all the monarchs of Europe wanted at this time. And so he brought this to several monarchs, including the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I. He brought it to Elizabeth, and he told them, this book has all the secrets of alchemy. And they said, oh, so you mean you can make us as much gold as we want? And
Always they go to the lowest place.
He said, well, no, but I can enlighten you. It'll bring you spiritual wisdom. And their response was, okay, next, please.
Exactly. Okay, so now how did he get into the good graces of Queen Elizabeth and become such a valued advisor to her? And what was the nature of the kind of advice he would render?
It's a fascinating story. So he was a loyalist to Elizabeth during Mary's reign and was brought in basically as a security guard, as a magical security guard to Elizabeth's court. As soon as she seized power, the outgoing regime was employing all these Catholic sorcerers, in a sense, to do, they were sticking, it's a real story, they were sticking voodoo, making voodoo dolls of her, sticking, all this crazy stuff, creating propaganda campaigns to make her look bad, doing all kinds of crazy magical things to try and take down her court. And so Dee was brought in to counteract this and be their kind of magical advisor. But he also became the scientific advisor, he became the mathematical advisor, he was one of the people who is instrumental in setting up the British Security Services, which later became MI5 and MI6
yes, we'll
with
talk
Sir
about
Francis
that
Walsingham.
Too.
Elizabeth referred to him as 007, that
Right.
was his code number, which became James Bond.
And Ian Fleming was tapped into this knowledge.
Yes. Ian Fleming's a fascinating, of course, the author of James Bond
Right.
is a fascinating guy. He was employed by, I believe, MI6 or MI5 during World War II to create propaganda campaigns to throw off the Nazi war effort. As part of this, he employed Aleister Crowley to falsify astrological charts for Rudolf Hess, so that he would so that he would be confused and do. It's so strange, but so that he would do wrong
bad
tank
decisions.
placements, bad decisions. Right? They never implemented the plan, but Fleming was so taken with this world of the occult that when he created James Bond, he named his creation 007, and he also patterned Blofeld, who's the head of Spectre, off Crowley, the ultimate bad guy.
Right. No, it is fascinating. So
The one with the white cat.
yes. I love it. You can't make this stuff up. It has to be born somewhere, and it apparently goes back to John Dee. So John Dee, how did he influence the field of the development of the field of intelligence?
Right. So during this time, England, you have to remember, was a tiny, impoverished country that was at the point of a stick of the Catholic bloc. All of Europe was Catholic outside of England and the Netherlands, and they were at extreme disadvantage. They had people were starving. They had very few material resources. So they were Elizabeth was doing everything she could to keep her country going and make sure that it survived. And during this time, they did set up the British intelligence services to counteract, as part of the war effort. And Dee's job during this, it was set up by Francis Walsingham. And as an aside, by the way, just for some more context, England was so poor at this time, people often accused Dee of dying of poverty, therefore how he couldn't have been such a good magician. The reality was that everyone was poor at this time.
Right.
Francis Walsingham, who started the intelligence services, financed it out of his own pocket because he couldn't get paid by Elizabeth to do it. That's how strapped the government was.
Right.
So Dee's role in this was getting information. They were very interested in collecting all of the occult information that was available in Europe. He was sent to discover this book called the Steganographia, to hunt for it throughout Europe. It was a grimoire that promised to not only have the secrets of cryptography, but also to contain a magical ritual that would allow somebody to spy on somebody else in the country, to call up a vision of what someone else was doing.
Well, that's what I was going to bring up next. I mean, they were doing real spying, real remote viewing, so to speak.
Yeah, remote viewing.
Exactly.
Yeah, basically, that's what they were trying to figure out.
Which makes sense. If you don't have any resources, you can't necessarily send people on the ground, get them on a train or a donkey or whatever to get where they need to go to do the research.
Right.
So you just go direct, right? And so did he have some success, as far as you can tell, by way of training other agents or being able to view?
As far as I know, he never actually directly engaged in it. They sent him to find the book. What he did do is he took the techniques and then applied them to his later work, scrying angels and talking to angels.
Okay.
And that went into his work trying to basically remote view angels, if you want to put it in those terms.
Right. Okay, so it's not surprising that John Dee had some detractors and even enemies. Who were John Prestel and Vincent Murfin, and why did they try to take him down?
Yes, so these two gentlemen were two very shady characters.
Gentlemen.
Yes, they were from fake alchemists and sorcerers. There's a real difference, and I think it's really important to make this distinction, and because it's important now also. There's a real difference between what we might, by way of oversimplification, call high magic and low magic. High magic is totally about understanding God and the universe, and it's like science. It's like it's about becoming
it's
spiritually.
Understanding the nature of reality.
Absolutely, and trying to become more enlightened and a better person.
Right.
That's it. That's high magic, and low magic is trying to use magic to get your way or hurt somebody or get money or
have power.
Totally, it's all these very vulgar, things that. That anyone who was interested in high magic would just not be interested in at all and be allergic to, essentially. But there are lots of people who are interested in it, and there were at the time. And these two gentlemen, Murfin and Prestel, were employed by the outgoing Catholic regime and also during Queen Mary's reign, if I remember correctly, to attack Elizabeth and Dee using magic. And they fought dirty. They used occult means like voodoo dolls and things like that to try and attack them, but they also, the main thing that they did was try to slander their public reputations by creating propaganda to say that, Dee was a black magician and a sorcerer, and Elizabeth was, part of the Antichrist and all of this, and that a woman a woman and specifically Elizabeth being on the throne of England was a sign of the end of the world, and they really wanted to stir up the public against the current ruling powers. And so it was an ongoing kind of gutter level war that those two guys waged against Dee and Elizabeth. And it's one that frankly Dee was not particularly prepared for, because he was an innocent in a way. He was a pure and very noble seeker after knowledge, and he just was not prepared for people to fight that dirty. And so he suffered from their propaganda attacks. His reputation suffers to this day, not just from their propaganda attacks, but by many other people's, including James I's regime, which came in after Elizabeth decided to sweep all magic under the carpet. And so Dee's reputation has been sullied. He was been called a black magician and a sorcerer. When he was the complete opposite. And that's something that I've tried to repair with this book.
Yes, clearly. I mean, you're doing a beautiful job of
Thank
it.
you.
I mean, and too, in that day, there was no defense against it. I mean, there was no, litigation over slander in the day. You just had to live with it.
The dark arts.
There was none. And so I think when we're talking about these kind of nuanced characters, this is a good time to bring in Edward Kelly and his association with Edward Kelly, and what they produced together.
Yes.
Because again, Edward was a mixed bag of human traits. And I just want to say this too. A lot of people really enjoyed the work in the 1960s, 70s of Ruth Montgomery, right? And her association and her channeled source was Arthur Ford. Arthur Ford had a major problem with alcohol and such, even when he was a medium in his day. And I bring this up because there is a kind of, if you look at it from a metaphysical point of view, a type of porosity that happens within the auric field, so to speak, of people who have addictions that allows for a permeability that really other beings can see through, come in through very easily compared to someone who is super healthy and they're in their zone. It's a different deal. That's not so permeable. And I bring it up because I think it's important to understand that's why so many psychics, even the best of them, are often very flawed on a deeply personal level. So here we go with Edward
That's
Kelly.
a fascinating, that's a very interesting point. I also think that a lot of, having known a lot of psychics and mediums, I think that a lot of psychics and mediums also struggle with being that open and empathic.
Absolutely.
They also struggle with being judged by society.
Yep.
And it's not an easy life.
No.
And so that's something that we need to, and I think I've known a lot of psychics and mediums with substance abuse issues.
Absolutely.
And so it's not so black and white.
It's not black and white at all. So I just bring that up so we can set the stage for yet another nuanced, colorful character.
Yes.
Counterfeiter and all.
Absolutely, yeah. So Dee is what we refer to as a hardhead, right? So he was, as I probably, you probably get a sense of him from what I've been saying.
Yes.
He was very intellectual. He was very academic. He was on the payroll of the government. He was hyper-rational. And so he did not have any innate psychic talent. He wasn't open. He wasn't empathic. He didn't have an artistic way of viewing the world. And so even though he was fascinated with the theory of magic, and he spent all the way up to the age of 50, he spent all of his time studying all the theory and the text and the academic side and all the little bits and pieces. But he himself, his attempts to actually make magic work were not successful because he didn't have, he couldn't go into a trance and go into altered states. And so what that meant was he had to employ people to do it with him. He had to employ psychics so that he would basically do a magical ritual to, let's say, talk to an angel, and then the psychic would have the vision of the angel instead of him, and he would write down what the psychic saw. So that's a working partnership that's very common in magic.
Yes,
we see it all the time.
Edgar Cayce and his wife and a lot of people, yes.
Okay.
Right.
And so they formed, Dee had auditioned several scryers, a scryer is a type of psychic that uses a piece of crystal or a crystal ball as a focus to go into a trance state. And he'd auditioned several of them. It was a very common role in England at this time. And to kind of middling success, but that changed when he met this fascinating character, Edward Kelly, who was found for him by a talent scout for psychics that the Crown had appointed. Interesting job titles of the Elizabethan age. And Edward Kelly he brings a long shadow with him. Yeah. He was half Dee's age when they met, so he was 25 or 26. Very overweight, an alcoholic. He had his ears cut off for being caught forging coins. He had been accused of necromancy and summoning corpses out of graves, some of which is probably exaggerated, some of which may be true. And Dee writes in his diary that the day that Kelly showed up at Mortlake, which was Dee's household, the moon turned blood red. It's like a Hammer horror movie or something. But despite his air of disrespectability, being from the wrong side of the tracks, he could do it. He had real psychic talent or whatever it is, ability to go into trances or just create a creative imagination, whatever it happened to be. And Dee was so impressed with his abilities that he put him on payroll for the next 7 years and had him do essentially channeling or psychic mediumship 3 times a day for the next 7 years, which was very, very hard on Kelly and really wore him down. It's also possible that he may have been using some type of substance to facilitate that, and keeping that type of schedule for that long of a period, using whatever substance it happened to be, whatever it was, can certainly have a toll on somebody. So he was very erratic. He had his ups and downs while in Dee's employ. They formed an incredible working partnership, and they generated over 1,000 pages of records of scrying angels and speaking to various spiritual beings, which are beautiful and profound and on par or greater in language than perhaps even the King James Bible, parts of them, and are incredible even just as a literary record. But there were certainly parts where Kelly became unhinged, it was a tumultuous working relationship, but a fascinating one at a human level between two very different individuals who formed a greater whole.
Well, that's why I brought up the difficulty of being open to other forces, because at the same time, kind of monstrous types of entities started manifesting for Dee and such as well. It's almost like these were kind of angelic beings kind of mixed in with a hodgepodge of some lower realm creatures.
Yeah. So as the sessions went on, at the beginning of the sessions, so first of all, the point of the sessions was for Dee to talk to angels. That's what he wanted. He wanted to communicate with angels because you have to remember, this is perhaps the smartest person of his age. He'd been all over Europe. He'd studied under all the great intellectual masters of the European universities. He was smarter, basically, probably than anyone in England. He had 5 times the books of Oxford and Cambridge, each of which had maybe 400, 500 books each. He had 2,500 books, maybe 4,000 at one point at Mortlake, which is probably why he was always broke, because he was spending all his money on books, which some of us can empathize with.
Yeah.
But he got to a point where he realized if he wanted to know anything more, he was going to have to, in his mind, speak to higher authorities. He couldn't learn anything more from human beings. And so his goal was to speak to the angels and make contact with them to recover the original knowledge of humanity. That was his goal. It was totally pure, totally spiritual, but he became involved with these different scryers in order to do that. Throughout the sessions, which lasted about 7 years, it was a real process. It wasn't cut and dry. What was happening was Dee and Kelly were being tuned up. The view of the angels when they manifested was, we're going to give you knowledge, but before you're worthy to receive it, you have to be purified. You have to be humbled. You have to be, all the defilements of your souls must be filed off, or removed. Because you can't just, receive higher knowledge. You have to be prepared, right? Even the Bible says this, right? And so many years went by where Dee and Kelly were being tested, purified, put through various intense situations that brought them always to greater levels of faith and humility. And in the beginning, they were being confronted by many demonic appearances. Mm-hmm. In fact, they couldn't yet tell the difference between demons and angels, but the angels showed them how. And part of the original sessions were, in a sense, an exorcism, where the angels were kicking out all the lower forces that they saw attached, to not just Dee and Kelly, but all humanity. And Kelly himself had spent a lot of time doing demonic types of magic for personal gain, and they picked up on that. And so most of the early sessions were the angels kind of pushing Kelly around and trying to get him shaped up so that he was spiritually pure enough to receive higher wisdom. And they had their work cut out for him because he was a rough character. Yeah. So, but as the sessions went on, once they got through that period, then it became almost purely angelic.
And what was the direction and nature of the body of work in summary? And then I do want to get into the end times scenario, the mission to save the 144,000 souls and who those actually were. So we'll lead from one question to the next.
Right. So when the angels appeared, which was pretty quickly after Kelly showed up, and the first thing that they did after putting Dee and Kelly through their paces is give them a system for making deeper contact, which is now referred to as Enochian magic, which is not a term they used at the time. It's a term later writers used. And the Enochian system and language, which is supposed to be the language that the angels spoke before the fall of Hermetic, was to tune them up and allow them deeper access to the angelic realms. Once they got through that, the angels made their agenda pretty clear, which is not different at all from really what is in the Bible. It was that humanity needs to be redeemed. They were not pleased with the Reformation. They weren't pleased with the Catholic Church either. They thought that humanity had entered a very debased and violent period of history, had fallen very far from the original teachings that are, either from the Old Testament or from Christ, hard to argue with. And they wanted to directly use Dee and Kelly as agents to advance their vision for the world, which is kind of intense, or very intense. What the angels wanted was, their view was, humans have had their chance to get it right. They haven't got it right. We would like to take the wheel now what we want is a new religion. It's a new Hermetic-based super religion, combining Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Islam, paganism even.
Into very Hermetic, yeah.
Very Hermetic. One universal religion of love, which will be ministered by the angels directly. They wanted humans to have a way to contact the divine realms one-on-one instead of having to deal with a corrupt institution, although they also thought that people should still be attached to the body of the church because it was an important tool. And communion was important and all of these things. But they wanted, almost to directly redeem humanity almost in spite of itself, which hasn't worked out very well.
No, they wanted a kind of global conversion.
Yes.
Yes. So they had their work cut out for them, proselytizing and trying to get buy-ins from in other countries, leadership, churches, and so forth.
Right.
Not easy.
Their original plan was they wanted, in addition to this, they wanted one world empire under Elizabeth as the sovereign, which Dee had already laid the groundwork for. And so when you step back and you see that Dee is responsible not only for creating the British Empire, which ruled most of the planet, but also potentially, the plan was to create one religion that ruled everybody. That's a big plan.
Yeah.
In a way, it has come true. I mean, I think that the British Empire, if you really step back and you look at the British Empire, or in some ways the American Empire, you can definitely see that parts of that have perhaps influenced people.
Let's get into, I think we can just kind of skip over this one part I wanted to get into about Kelly's life. Because of the lack of funding and the constant need for patronage, he tended to flip allegiances to work for, whether it's Protestant, Catholic, or whatnot, kind of anybody, in a sense, so that he could get the funds needed to do his real work, right?
Yeah, and the crazy thing is the angels encouraged him in that.
Yeah.
They kind of said, look, you're working for us now, and you have a direct connection. Don't worry too much about
this petty politics of the planet.
And they were helpful in steering him. There were many times that the Catholic Church, the Jesuits probably would have killed him multiple times. They were trying to bring Dee and Kelly to the Vatican, where they probably would have been tortured and killed for heresy.
Right.
And there are many times where they narrowly avoided disaster.
So they were probably looked after.
Yeah, I mean, it's all there in the records. It's
absolutely
crazy.
Okay, so let's get into the 144,000, the end time scenario, 12 tribes of Israel, New World Order, all of that, and then start getting into the implications of how that carried down through history and how it's still playing out today, because this is really the crux of it in a lot of ways.
It's a big question.
Yeah, big one, and we have time.
Okay.
Big answers are good.
So basically what the angels said is humanity should be directly redeemed, and what they thought is the events of the book of Revelation need to be reenacted. And the angels, they wanted a salvation plan for humanity. They thought that it was already the end of the world and humanity was laboring under the reign of the Antichrist, which it's interesting to think about because we often look at these things as literal. Like somebody's always coming out saying the end of the world is next Thursday. But if you really step back again, and I think that, divine events, whatever, these things probably play out on long timelines, even if you just look at them as metaphorical. Just from the Elizabethan era was, 400 years ago, 500 years ago. If you think about how much things have crumbled since then, the degradation of the environment, the pollution of the planet, I mean, it's hard to argue that things aren't at least a little bit apocalyptic. So Dee was convinced that the angels told him the world would end in 88, and he thought this meant 1588. But it seems they meant something else, or it was, they never said it would be a specific date. It seems that, for beings like that, they probably see on very long time frames.
Yeah.
Right. So, but what they wanted was to prepare the way for the salvation of humanity, and their way of doing that was this idea of a new religion and a new, the spread of Christianity around the planet, which is what happened thanks to the British Empire, or no thanks, depending on what your view on that is. A lot of people
Imperialism has an up and down side for sure.
A lot of people suffered.
Yes, a lot.
And so that's kind of what happened, and when the British Empire spread around the planet, it was with that mythology. Whether that comes from Dee directly is arguable, but he certainly had an influence. And the ideology of the British Empire was spreading Christianity and thereby civilization around the planet, and thereby saving people even at sword point. When
Yeah.
global power transferred to the American Empire after the British Empire fell around World War I, the story was the same. You know, America, particularly if you look at the evangelical right in America, there was a Pew Forum study in 2006 that said that 1 in 3 Americans believes that this is that Jesus will return in our lifetimes. And it's not, it's far from being a fringe belief. It's, in fact, probably the dominant belief in America.
If you drive across the country and listen to the only stations that have any wattage, which are Christian radio stations, fundamentalist Christian radio stations, you hear the talk a lot as you're driving along.
Right.
It's kind of shocking if you're not part of that group.
Right, yeah. And you look at the things like the success of the Left Behind books, which are the most popular books in America, I think, outside of the Bible, more than Stephen King.
Yeah.
So literalism, fundamentalist literalism, it's a big, and it's not just the public, it's also, I think that apocalyptic literalism has been a driving force in both British and then American politics, absolutely.
That's what I was going to ask you, because the elite
years.
power circles, this really factors hugely in, almost like in the belief it's best for all concerned to hasten the end of times. And that's that's dangerous, and that's what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. I mean, you look at, during the Reagan administration, Reagan believed that it was his divinely appointed gift, as inspired by Hal Lindsey, who was a famous Christian writer in the 70s, that it was the end of the world, and his divinely appointed role was to hasten or shepherd humanity through the end of days and the fight with Gog and Magog, which was Russia, and that he was God's directly chosen, appointee to do that. Now, this seems, a little eccentric until you realize that this was a game that was and is being played with nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Right. I mean, this was something that was enacted as mutually assured destruction. And during the second Bush II, the Bush Jr. administration, George Bush, also very influenced by Billy Graham, by the evangelicals, believed that it was his divine mission to hasten the apocalypse by going to war in the Middle East. He famously attempted to elicit the support of Jacques Chirac in France in the war effort by telling him that he'd had a vision in prayer that he'd seen Gog and Magog at work in the Middle East. This is perhaps not who we should have steering the ship in a 21st century technological society, but it's certainly...
It's still there. It's still there it's steering the show.
But we need to understand it, because it's, to dismiss it, I think, would also be a mistake, because it's so many people believe it. And, I'm always of the opinion, I've long been of the opinion as a journalist and a writer, that if you want to understand why people do the things that they do, you have to look at what they believe.
Right.
And you have to and you have to take it seriously, at least that they take it seriously, and not be dismissive or look down at it. I think that if we want to understand each other as human beings, we need to understand each other's beliefs. You can't understand why the right, the evangelical right does what it does without understanding the script they're following. And so I think for that reason it's important for that reason and many more, I think it's important to understand.
I think so too, and I just recently interviewed an author named Mark Stavish, and he had written about egregores, right? And when you speak about the notion of an egregore, perhaps one of the biggest, most powerful egregores in existence is the end times notion.
Yeah.
And so that does have a life of its own, and does feed back to those who are in positions of power and decision making.
Absolutely, and it's not just Christianity. It's all of the world religions have that.
With the fundamentalist world religions in particular, yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I read a lot of material from people who were in Bush Jr.'s White House and things like that, and Reagan's. And it's not just the Republicans, by the way, it's Democrats as well. It's on both sides. As people get closer to, it's a mythology that's very appealing to people in power, because it grants them a sense of having a special divine role to play on the world stage. And even people who don't start out as very evangelical become very interested in that way of thinking, which is understandable. But it's just something that's been with humanity for a long time. And again, it's not just Christianity; it's lots of different religions. My personal view is, yes, and we should focus on also some sustainability plans. Like, if the world doesn't end, maybe we should make sure things are okay here.
I'm in your camp. Nice to make some better plans than that. So let's get down to the notion of, we have about 5 minutes left to kind of wrap this. Let's get down to the notion. These people who are power elite believe that they are among the ones who will be saved. They are always among the chosen ones, no matter what, you know. And so who are the 144,000? How was that originally put out in Dee's day?
So in the book of Revelations, there's a bit about the 144,000 that will be saved at the end of the world. Elaine Pagels, who's a fascinating and brilliant scholar on Gnosticism, has a very interesting take on this, where, having examined the original political context of this, that evangelical Christians will not like this. The book of Revelation was written by John of Patmos during the time following the death of Christ, from a very different perspective of the rest of the New Testament. There were the point she makes very convincingly is that following the death of Christ, there were actually two different factions of Christians. There were the Jewish converts to the new religion or it wasn't even a new religion. There were the Jewish people who believed that Christ was the Jewish Messiah, and then many who did not, right? Which is now the mainstream view in Judaism. There were also, when Saul of Tarsus had his conversion on the road to Damascus and became St. Paul long after the death of Christ, he said that he was given a vision that he should open up the covenant to all nations, meaning the original covenant between Moses and the Jewish people, and that this was for everyone, and that he was going to, it had to be opened. And so he then became the head of this new thing called Christianity, which has now become the most successful religion in world history. But what he did was convert Greek and Roman pagans and even people from North Africa to this new religion. This was not the original, this was. You can imagine the Jewish people who accepted Christ as the Messiah being like, "Hey, wait a minute! That's not what this is about. Like, Christ was here to fulfill the covenant with us. It wasn't to be open to all people." And so, what you have in the New Testament is the Pauline letters, which are from the camp following St. Paul, and then you have Revelation, which was written from the perspective of the Jewish followers of Christ. And in the book of Revelation, when they talk about the 144,000 to be saved, what that originally meant was the Jewish followers of Christ, and that everyone else was not to be saved, which is contentious.
Contentious,
yes,
to say the least. Okay, so now that's been kind of flipped, and if you listen to the Jehovah's Witness, then it's a whole different story again, right?
Everybody's
got their story of the 144,000.
Isn't religion fun?
Isn't it fun? So we have just a couple minutes left to take it back into this kind of larger story. How would you wrap this part? We literally have 2 minutes. Wrap this part of the story back into John Dee and his contributions.
I think that it's important to understand that this time period, the ideas that were formulated in this time period are still with us. I see John Dee as like a computer programmer who created the computer code that our society is running on. And to understand that code, and perhaps to change it and update it for the modern world, we should understand where it came from. And I would particularly like to underline that the apocalyptic idea is much more dangerous to us as a species now that we have nuclear weapons, now that we have nanotechnology, biotechnology, the ability to kill people many, many times over, everyone, all life, when we're at the brink of ecological collapse. So perhaps we need John Dee created one myth, perhaps we need a new one that's a bit more supportive, of life.
I couldn't agree more. And is it, can we get our hands on the Monas Hieroglyphica?
Sure, yeah, you can find it online. It's freely available as a PDF.
And would you recommend we all read it?
I would say start with John Dee and the Empire of Angels to get it in context. It's very opaque if you don't know the context.
I was going to say, if you did all that in 10 pages, we need to read your book first. And I hear your book is doing fabulously.
Doing very well. Thank you.
Wow, you went through 4 printings how quickly?
In the first month.
In the first month, wow. Well, you know what? You deserve it. You did your job right.
Thank you.
And thank you for trying to put some truth around the legend of this man.
Thank you.
The work of John Dee has cast a long shadow over 5 centuries, both in the area of espionage and military intelligence, and also in the wider field of spirituality and human potential. When I was a young Christian, I used to think that experiences of remote viewing were the exclusive preserve of people like me in Christian ministry, that these were divine gifts given for ministry. But as I got to know more people, I realized that there are plenty of people with no religious affiliation, no interest in spirituality, who nevertheless are able to do these things. And it began to occur to me that this might in fact be a human ability, a natural cognitive ability that we can engage with and enhance. And in more recent years, I've experienced it at such a rate that I've come to the conclusion that's what it is. We're looking at higher cognitive abilities, just as was suggested by Johannes Trithemius in the Steganographia, that book that Queen Elizabeth I was so eager to get her hands on. But there is another side to it. And I know people in the church scene who, when they speak about far sight and future sight, are describing contact modalities very similar to what John Dee and Edward Kelly were on about. Now, if you'd like to see the full conversation between Regina and Jason, go to Gaia.com, where you'll find an amazing library of fascinating interviews and documentaries. Remember to like, subscribe, and click on the bell here on the Paul Wallis channel, and I will look forward to seeing you in the comments. Until next time, health and peace. For the full interview, go to Gaia.com/Paul Wallis to unlock your full access membership. Follow the links in the description below.